January 6, 1944. The cold English air hung thick over the 8th Air Force headquarters at High Wycombe. Inside, Major General Jimmy Doolittle stood in the office of Major General William Kepner, commander of the 8th Fighter Command. On the wall behind Kepner's desk hung a sign that every man in the building had seen and understood. The first duty of 8th Air Force fighters is to bring the bombers back alive. Doolittle read it twice, his jaw tightening. Then he turned to Kepner and said quietly, "That sign needs to come down. It's wrong." Within hours, a new sign replaced it, one that would change the air war forever. The first duty of 8th Air Force fighters is to destroy German fighters. It was more than just a change in words. It was the beginning of a revolution in strategy, one that would shatter the Luftwaffe, win air supremacy over Europe, and decide the fate of the coming invasion of Normandy. The crisis that forced Doolittle's hand had been building for months. On October 14, 1943, nearly 300 American B-17 bombers roared toward Schweinfurt, deep inside Germany. Their target was vital: ball-bearing plants that kept the German war machine turning. The mission succeeded. The bombs hit their mark, but the cost was unbearable. 60 bombers never came home. 17 more were damaged beyond repair. 600 men, dead or missing in a single afternoon. In those grim days, bomber crews faced odds so terrible that surviving a full 25-mission tour was almost impossible. During the worst of 1943, only 1 in 3 bomber crews made it through. Lieutenant Robert Morgan of the Memphis Belle wrote in his diary that night, "We are being slaughtered. The fighters turn back at the German border, and we fly on alone into hell." The problem was painfully clear. American escort fighters, the P-38 Lightning and P-47 Thunderbolt, simply couldn't fly far enough. They lacked the range to follow the bombers deep into Germany. Over Schweinfurt, they had turned back 300 miles from the target, leaving the bombers to fight alone. Waiting for them were hundreds of German fighters, Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, trained in brutal, efficient tactics. They attacked in head-on waves, firing 30mm cannons and air-to-air rockets that could tear a B-17 apart with a single hit. The sky became a slaughterhouse. By December 1943, General Henry Hap Arnold, commander of the U.S. Army Air Forces, had seen enough. He issued an ultimatum: unless the German Air Force is destroyed, Operation Overlord cannot proceed. The invasion of France, D-Day, depended on winning the skies. Either the Luftwaffe died, or the Allied bombing campaign would. A solution appeared in November: a sleek silver machine that looked more like a racer than a weapon. The North American P-51 Mustang. Fitted with a Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, it could fly faster, higher, and farther than anything before it. With drop tanks, it could escort bombers to any target in Germany and back again. Captain Chuck Yeager later said simply, "The P-51 is faster, climbs better, and turns tighter than anything the Germans have. This changes everything. But range alone wouldn't win the war." The real question was how to use these new fighters. For years, escort doctrine had been defensive. Fighters flew tight around bomber formations, staying close. Visible guardians with strict orders never to stray far. When German fighters attacked, the escorts chased them briefly, then returned to formation. It sounded logical, but in practice, it meant American fighters always reacted. The Germans always chose the time and place. They could hit, kill, and vanish before the escorts could respond. The bombers were meat on the table. Jimmy Doolittle, newly appointed commander of the 8th Air Force, saw it differently. He wasn't a bomberman. He was a fighter pilot, a test pilot, and an engineer who understood air combat like few others. 2 years earlier, he had led the daring Tokyo Raid, the first American strike on Japan, earning the Medal of Honor. Now, with Arnold's trust and the weight of the air war on his shoulders, he prepared to overturn decades of doctrine. On his first full day in command, Doolittle gave his order. Fighters were no longer to fly defensively. They would not circle bombers like sheepdogs. Instead, they would range far ahead, up to 50 miles forward and 25 miles on either side, hunting German aircraft wherever they gathered. When the bombers turned for home, the fighters would not return with them. They would dive to low altitude, strafing airfields, destroying planes on the ground, attacking trains, fuel depots, and anything that moved. The goal was no longer just to protect the bombers. The goal was to destroy the Luftwaffe itself. The reaction was explosive. Some fighter pilots cheered. They had long wanted freedom to hunt. "We are no longer shepherds," Colonel Don Blakeslee told his men. "We are wolves." But the bomber crews were horrified. "They're abandoning us," one navigator wrote. "We'll be slaughtered without them." To many, Doolittle's order looked like suicide. But Doolittle knew something they didn't. The best way to protect bombers was to destroy enemy fighters before they ever got close. The first test came on January 29, 1944. Over 800 bombers headed toward Frankfurt, escorted by the new Mustangs of the 357th Fighter Group. As the bombers droned east, the P-51 surged far ahead, sweeping the sky. Near Bonn, they spotted 50 Messerschmitts climbing to intercept. The Germans never saw them coming. The Mustangs dove from the sun, their Merlin engines screaming. In 8 minutes, 13 German fighters fell from the sky. 2 Mustangs were damaged, but both returned home. Not a single bomber was lost to that formation. For the first time, the hunters had become the hunted. 3 weeks later came the ultimate test, Operation Argument, better known as Big Week. It was a trap. American planners knew the Luftwaffe couldn't ignore attacks on its aircraft factories, so they planned a series of raids meant to draw every German fighter into the air. On February 20th, 1944, over 1,000 bombers took off from England and Italy, escorted by hundreds of fighters. The Germans threw everything they had, nearly 900 interceptors. The sky over central Germany turned into a maelstrom of contrails, fire, and falling wreckage. But this time, the Americans had the advantage. The Mustangs, Thunderbolts, and Lightnings were everywhere, slashing through German formations, ambushing them as they formed up, strafing airfields as they tried to land. Major Heinz Baer, one of Germany's top aces, wrote in despair, "We shoot down bombers, but the fighters are everywhere. They attack us before we can climb, when we land, when we take off. There is no escape." For 5 days, Big Week raged. The Americans lost 226 bombers and 28 fighters, heavy losses, but sustainable. The Luftwaffe lost more than 350 aircraft, and, more critically, nearly 100 experienced pilots. These were men with years of combat experience, leaders, mentors, instructors. They could not be replaced. The new German pilots entering combat in 1944 often had less than 150 hours of total flight time, barely enough to control their aircraft, let alone fight in them. The Americans, by contrast, trained their pilots for over 450 hours before combat. Skill, experience, and numbers were all shifting toward the Allies. By March, the effects of Doolittle's doctrine were unmistakable. When 8th Air Force bombers struck Berlin on March 6th, the Luftwaffe sent everything it had. The result was a massacre. The Americans lost 69 bombers. The Germans lost more than twice as many fighters and nearly 70 of their best pilots. "Today," one German officer wrote, "I watched the fighter arm die." The Luftwaffe could still produce aircraft. Germany built over 1,000 new fighters each month, but it could not produce pilots to fly them. The veterans were gone. The replacements died within weeks. Training hours fell to as low as 50. It was a death spiral. By April, the balance of power had completely reversed. The Luftwaffe that had terrorized Allied crews in 1943 was now a shadow of its former self. Its airfields were bombed daily, its fuel depots burned, and its pilots ambushed, even during takeoff. On May 8, 1944, 900 American bombers crossed into Germany, escorted by 750 fighters. Not a single German plane rose to intercept them. For the first time, the Luftwaffe had ceded the skies. Galland, the once confident German air commander, reported grimly to Göring, "The fighter force is destroyed. We have aircraft, but we cannot fly them for lack of fuel and pilots. The Americans attack at will." 1 month later, on June 6th, the proof of Doolittle's gamble filled the skies over Normandy. 14,000 Allied sorties blanketed the invasion beaches. German fighters managed fewer than 300. Field Marshal Rommel wrote to his wife, "The enemy has complete air superiority. Our troops cannot move in daylight without being attacked. The war is lost." What had once seemed reckless had become genius. The new sign hanging in Kepner's office was vindicated. Between January and June 1944, the Luftwaffe lost over 2,500 fighter pilots, 3/4 of its strength. The average German pilot's experience fell from 200 combat hours to less than 50. American fighters achieved kill ratios exceeding 4-to-1. By year's end, the Luftwaffe was a hollow shell. Doolittle's decision had done exactly what Arnold demanded. It destroyed the German Air Force as an effective fighting force before D-Day. The bombers that once flew into hell now crossed Europe with minimal losses. The cost was immense. Over 26,000 American airmen died in the skies over Europe, more than the entire U.S. Marine Corps lost in the Pacific. Yet their sacrifice secured a freedom no army could have won without them. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, who became one of America's top aces, said later, "We talk about tactics and numbers, but really it came down to thousands of young men flying into combat every day, knowing many wouldn't come back. We won because we attacked. Doolittle taught us that." By August 1944, the Luftwaffe existed only on paper. Germany still built planes, tens of thousands of them, but lacked the pilots, the fuel, and the will to use them. Even revolutionary jets like the Me-262 came too late. The pilots who might have used them had already been killed that spring. "We had aircraft in abundance," one surviving German ace later said, "but no one left to fly them." History would remember that quiet moment in January 1944. The WWII Jimmy Doolittle ordered a sign removed from an office wall as the turning point of the air war. A simple change in doctrine, a few words on a wall, transformed the course of World War II. When asked years later if he ever doubted his decision, Doolittle replied, "Changing the fighter tactics was the hardest thing I did. People thought it was madness, but you can't win a war by defending. You win by attacking." Today, both signs, the original and its replacement, hang side by side in the U.S. Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio. Together they tell the story of how one general's insight rewrote the laws of aerial warfare. The first duty of 8th Air Force fighters is to destroy enemy fighters. It was a lesson paid for in blood, but it gave the Allies the skies and, ultimately, victory in Europe.